The Silent Invasion. Admiral Kenza Williams stood at her office window in the lunar base, staring at the gleaming sphere of Earth below. The message she'd just received from the Galactic Council weighed heavily on her mind. After 15 years of serving as humanity's primary liaison to the interstellar community, she'd never seen anything like this. The crystalline entities had appeared 6 months ago in the Andromeda arm of the galaxy. At first, they seemed harmless, microscopic crystalline structures that drifted through space like cosmic dust. The advanced civilizations of the Myriad Alliance hardly paid attention to them, their sophisticated detection systems categorizing them as natural phenomena. That was their first mistake. Within weeks, entire planetary systems began going dark. The pattern was always the same. Communication would gradually degrade, defense systems would inexplicably fail, and then all contact would cease. When investigation teams finally arrived, they found worlds trapped in technological paralysis. Every piece of advanced technology was rendered useless, transformed into glittering crystal gardens that pulsed with alien intelligence. The Myriad Alliance, with their quantum computers and artificial intelligences, found themselves helpless. Their most advanced weapon systems turned against them before they could even be deployed. Their neural networks, the pride of 10,000 years of development, became conduits for the crystalline invasion. Admiral Williams, her assistant's voice crackled through the old-fashioned intercom. "The council representatives are ready for you in the analog conference room." Kenza smiled slightly at the word analog. When Earth joined the galactic community, their insistence on maintaining redundant analog systems had been met with mockery. Now, those same systems made the lunar base one of the few secure meeting locations left in the galaxy. The conference room was a testament to human stubbornness. While other species conducted their meetings through neural interfaces and holographic projections, this room featured paper maps, mechanical calculators, and vacuum tube radios. The alien representatives looked uncomfortable sitting in the simple wooden chairs, their environmental suits humming as they adapted to the primitive conditions. "Welcome to Luna Base," Kenza addressed the gathered representatives. "I understand you've brought new information about the crystal entities." Ambassador Zillar, a being of pure energy contained within a crystalline matrix, moved forward. The irony of his natural form wasn't lost on anyone present. The situation has deteriorated further. The Centauri Defense Network fell 3 days ago. The entities have evolved. They're learning to infiltrate systems faster than we can isolate them. "What about the quantum quarantine protocols?" Kenza asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Useless," replied Director Venn, her mechanical exoskeleton notably powered down to minimum functions. "The more sophisticated the defense, the more quickly they subvert it. We've lost contact with 37 major systems in the past week alone." Kenza walked to one of the paper maps spread across the conference table. It showed the known spread of the crystal entities, marked with simple red pins. "Tell me something. Has anyone tried fighting them without advanced technology?" The room fell silent. Ambassador Zillar's energy form flickered in what might have been embarrassment. "Our civilizations don't. We haven't operated without neural interfaces and AI support for millennia. The concept of regressing our military technology is primitive." Kenza finished for him. "Like this conference room." Director Venn's mechanical limbs whirred as she shifted position. "What are you suggesting, Admiral?" Kenza pulled out a simple piece of chalk and began drawing on the old blackboard mounted on the wall. "The crystal entities operate by infiltrating and subverting digital systems. They corrupt code, transform circuitry, and use our own technology against us. But what if we fought them with technology they can't infiltrate? Technology that doesn't have code to corrupt or circuits to crystallize." She sketched out a rough diagram of old Earth military equipment, ballistic weapons, analog radar systems, vacuum tube radios. Humanity never fully abandoned these technologies. We kept them as backups, as redundancies, even when the rest of the galaxy called us paranoid. Every military base on Earth still maintains analog systems alongside the digital ones. Every ship in our fleet can operate on manual controls if necessary. The alien representatives stared at the drawings with a mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension. Ambassador Ziller's energy form pulsed rapidly. "You're suggesting we fight an enemy that has defeated our most advanced technological achievements, with primitive projectile weapons and manual targeting systems." "Exactly." Kenza's chalk scratched across the blackboard as she continued drawing. "The crystal entities expect to encounter AI-driven defense systems, quantum computers, neural networks. They've evolved to counter technology that's far more advanced than what we're proposing. But how do you corrupt a system that runs on gears and springs instead of code? How do you infiltrate a radio that uses vacuum tubes instead of microchips?" Director Ven's exoskeleton hummed as she processed the concept. The logistics would be challenging. Most species haven't manufactured analog technology for generations. We don't have the facilities, the knowledge base. "But Earth does," Kenza replied. "We never stopped producing analog systems. Our military academies still train officers in manual navigation and targeting. Our factories can still manufacture vacuum tubes and mechanical computers. We can help other species retrofit their ships and bases with analog systems." The room erupted in discussion, the representatives talking over each other as they considered the implications. Some voiced skepticism, others showed cautious interest. But they all fell silent when the long-range radio in the corner crackled to life. "Luna Base, this is Proxima Station." A voice emerged through the static. "We're detecting crystalline activity in the outer system. Estimated time to reach Earth orbit, 72 hours. Kenza turned to face the assembled representatives, her expression grave but determined. "It seems we'll have a chance to test our theory sooner than expected. The question is, are you willing to take a step backward in order to move forward?" The aliens looked at each other, then at their powered-down devices and simplified environmental suits. They had already taken the first step simply by coming to this analog conference room. Now they had to decide if they were willing to go further, to embrace what they had long dismissed as primitive in order to save their civilizations. Ambassador Ziller was the first to speak. "Earth has always been considered young among galactic civilizations. Perhaps it's time we acknowledge that youth doesn't always equal disadvantage. Sometimes, those who have lived through less advanced stages of development retain knowledge that the more evolved have forgotten." Kenza nodded and turned back to the blackboard. "Then let's begin. We have 72 hours to prepare Earth's defenses, and if we succeed here, we'll have proved that sometimes the best way to fight the future is with the past." Digital hunters. Deep in the Australian outback, the radio telescope array at Murchison sprawled across the red Earth like a giant mechanical spider web. While most of Earth's advanced quantum observation posts had been shut down as a precaution against crystal entity infiltration, this decades-old facility had become humanity's primary early warning system. Dr. Maya Patil adjusted the frequency knobs with practiced precision, her fingers dancing across controls that would have been considered museum pieces by most galactic standards. The soft hum of vacuum tubes and the gentle whir of cooling fans filled the control room, sounds that had largely disappeared from more advanced facilities. "Got something," she called out, her voice cutting through the quiet buzz of activity. "Sector 47, following the same signature we tracked near Proxima." Admiral Williams leaned over her shoulder, studying the oscilloscope's green trace as it painted patterns across the screen. In the week since the emergency conference at Luna Base, they'd discovered that the crystal entities left a distinctive signature in the electromagnetic spectrum, one that modern quantum sensors were too refined to detect, but that old radio telescopes could pick up as clear as day. "How many?" the Admiral asked, her eyes fixed on the dancing waves. Maya adjusted a dial, bringing the signal into sharper focus. 3 distinct clusters, moving in formation. They're being more cautious this time, keeping to the gaps in our sensor network, or at least what they think is our sensor network. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The crystal entities were deliberately avoiding the advanced detection grids, not realizing that their true observers were the supposedly obsolete radio telescopes that they ignored completely. "Admiral," a voice called from across the room. "Message from the Myriad Alliance fleet. They're requesting permission to engage the entities at the heliobos." Kenza straightened up, shaking her head. "Denied. Tell them to maintain their current position. We're not ready to reveal our hand yet." The past week had seen a flurry of activity across Earth and its colonies. While the crystal entities approach, humanity had been busy stripping advanced technology from their defensive systems and replacing them with analog alternatives. The process was far from complete, but they'd managed to retrofit several key installations and ships with what they called retrotech, modern systems rebuilt using analog principles. "Dr. Patel," Kenza said, "show me the tracking data from the last 72 hours. Maya pulled up a series of paper charts, each marked with handwritten notations. Together, they formed a clear picture of the entity's movement patterns. Unlike their previous attacks, where they had rushed headlong into heavily defended systems, the crystals were being more methodical in their approach to Earth. "They're learning," Maya observed, tracing the pattern with her finger. "See how they're probing our outer defenses. They must have encountered enough resistance in other systems to develop more sophisticated tactics. But they're still operating on assumptions based on advanced technology," Kenza replied, a slight smile playing at her lips. "They expect us to rely on quantum communications, neural networks, AI defense systems. They have no way of knowing that we're watching them with technology so old it might as well be invisible to them." A young technician approached, carrying a vacuum-sealed container. Inside, visible through the clear walls, a small crystal cluster floated in a magnetic field. It had been captured during a brief skirmish near Mars, one of the few specimens they'd managed to obtain intact. "The laboratory results are in," the technician reported. "The entities appear to operate on principles similar to quantum computers, but with a crystalline structure that can physically reconfigure itself to infiltrate and modify electronic systems. They're like living computer viruses that can alter hardware as well as software." Maya studied the floating crystal. No wonder they've been so effective against advanced civilizations. Modern technology is built on quantum principles. It's practically inviting them in. "But our analog systems are too simple to infiltrate," Kenza finished. "You can't hack vacuum tubes or mechanical computers. There's nothing for them to latch onto. No code to corrupt, no quantum states to manipulate." A series of sharp beeps from the monitoring station interrupted their discussion. Maya rushed back to her instruments, her hands flying over the controls. "Admiral, the clusters are accelerating. They've changed formation, and they're heading straight for Mars." Kenza moved to the central communications station, a sturdy console built with technology that would have been cutting edge in the 1960s. "All stations, this is Admiral Williams. Operation Retrograde is now in effect. I repeat, Operation Retrograde is in effect." Across Earth and throughout the solar system, hundreds of facilities began powering down their advanced systems, switching to analog backups that had been carefully prepared over the past week. Modern warships shut down their AI cores, their crews switching to manual control. Defense platforms replaced their quantum targeting systems with mechanical computers and vacuum tube circuits. "Send word to the Myriad Alliance fleet," Kenza ordered. "Tell them to fall back to their designated positions and await further instructions. And get me a secure line to the Mars Defense Command. It's time to see if our retrotech gambit pays off." As the orders went out, carried by radio waves rather than quantum entanglement, Maya continued tracking the crystal entity's approach. Their movement had become more aggressive, more confident. They clearly expected to encounter the same kind of resistance they'd overcome so easily in other systems. "They think they're hunting us," Maya said softly, watching the signal traces march across her screen. "They don't realize that we've been hunting them." Kenza nodded, her expression grim but determined. "That's exactly what we want them to think. Sometimes the best trap is the one that looks like a weakness rather than a strength." The crystal entities continued their advance, unaware that they were heading not into another technologically advanced civilization, but into humanity's carefully prepared analog ambush. The real test of their strategy was about to begin, and the fate of not just Earth, but the entire galaxy, might depend on humanity's ability to fight the future with weapons from the past. The analog revolution. The red plains of Mars stretched out below the observation dome of Olympus Base, the planet's dust-laden atmosphere casting everything in a rusty haze. Colonel Sarah Chen watched as her crews worked to convert the base's defense systems, replacing quantum shields with overlapping fields generated by massive vacuum tube arrays. The technology was old, almost crude by modern standards, but that was exactly the point. "Last battery coming online now, Colonel," reported Lieutenant Rodriguez, his voice coming through a hardwired intercom system. "All digital systems are powered down and isolated. We're running purely on retrotech." Sarah acknowledged the report, her eyes fixed on the Martian sky. Somewhere up there, the crystal entities were approaching, expecting to find another helpless advanced civilization. Instead, they would find humanity's first line of defense, a testing ground for their analog strategy. "Message from Earth, Colonel," called out her communications officer, the radio equipment crackling with atmospheric interference. "Admiral Williams confirms the entities will reach Mars orbit in approximately 6 hours. The Myriad Alliance fleet is in position to observe, but has been ordered to hold back unless specifically called for support." Sarah smiled grimly. The alien fleet, with all its advanced technology powered down, was essentially there to witness whether humanity's primitive approach would work. Their own ships were too vulnerable to risk in direct combat with the crystals. "Status report from all stations," she ordered, moving to the central command table where a mechanical plotting board tracked the positions of their forces. "Phobos Defense Station reports ready, running on auxiliary power and analog systems only. Dauntless platform standing by, all retrofitted weapons charged and operational. Surface batteries 1 through 12, converted and operational. Mars Orbital Guard reports all ships successfully retrofitted and in position." The reports continued, each confirmation representing another piece of their defensive network that had been stripped of advanced technology and rebuilt using principles that predated the digital age. It had been a massive undertaking, requiring them to essentially rebuild their entire defensive infrastructure in just over a week. "Colonel," Lieutenant Rodriguez called out, his voice tight with tension, "we're picking up something on the long-range trackers." Sarah moved to the tracking station, where a series of analog displays showed the approaching threats. The crystal entities had divided into smaller groups, spreading out in a pattern that would have been devastating against conventional modern defenses. They clearly expected to encounter and overwhelm sophisticated electronic countermeasures. "They're maintaining their standard attack formation," Sarah observed. "No indication they've detected anything unusual about our defenses. Send word to all stations. Maintain emission discipline. No active scanning. No powered shields. Let them think we're defenseless." The next few hours were tense as they watched the crystal entities draw closer. The Martian Defense Force remained passive, their retrofitted systems running in passive mode only, appearing to all modern sensors as if their defensive grid was offline or destroyed. Finally, the entities reached the outer orbit of Mars. They paused briefly, probably scanning for defensive systems with their quantum sensors. Finding nothing that matched their expectations, they began their approach to the planet. "All stations, this is Colonel Chen." Sarah broadcast across the hardline communication network. "Initiate Operation Retrograde on my mark." The crystal entities crossed the orbital line they had designated as their trigger point. Sarah took a deep breath, then gave the order that would test their entire strategy. "Mark." Across the Martian surface and in orbit, systems that had appeared dead suddenly hummed to life, not with the quiet efficiency of modern technology, but with the raw physical power of analog electronics. Massive vacuum tubes powered up, generating electromagnetic fields that the crystal entities had no reference for in their quantum-based consciousness. The first indication that their strategy was working came when the nearest cluster of entities suddenly stopped, their crystalline structures visibly disturbed by the unfamiliar energy patterns surrounding them. "Direct hit on Array 7, reported the weapons officer. "Mechanical computing systems confirming positive effect. The entities are attempting to reorient, but they're not adapting to our targeting systems." Sarah watched as their retrofitted weapons, rail guns controlled by mechanical computers, plasma projectors powered by vacuum tubes, and electromagnetic disruptors built with technology that predated the digital age, began to take their toll on the crystal swarm. The entities tried to respond, attempting to infiltrate and corrupt the defensive systems as they had done so many times before. But there were no computers to hack, no digital networks to infiltrate, no quantum states to manipulate. They encountered only analog circuits, mechanical computers, and vacuum tubes, technology so basic that their sophisticated infiltration methods were useless against it. "Multiple entities breaking formation," called out the tracking officer. There, they appeared to be attempting to retreat. But retreat wasn't as simple as it had been in previous encounters. The overlapping fields generated by the analog defense systems created a web of disruption that the crystal entities couldn't easily navigate. Their quantum-based nature, which had made them so effective against advanced technology, now made them vulnerable to the crude but powerful effects of analog electronics. "Message from Admiral Williams," the communications officer announced. "The Myriad Alliance fleet is reporting significant disruption in the crystal entity's cohesion. They're requesting permission to begin collecting samples for analysis." Sarah nodded, allowing herself a small smile. "Tell them to proceed with caution, and inform Admiral Williams that Operation Retrograde appears to be a success. Mars stands ready to support Earth's defense when the main force arrives." As the battle wound down, with the remaining crystal entities either destroyed or in retreat, Sarah looked out at the Martian landscape again. The Red Planet had just witnessed humanity's first major victory against an enemy that had devastated countless advanced civilizations, and they had achieved it not by pushing technology forward, but by reaching back to their past. "Colonel," Lieutenant Rodriguez approached with a printed report. "Initial analysis suggests we destroyed or captured approximately 60% of the enemy force. The rest have withdrawn beyond Mars orbit, but they appear to be regrouping." "They'll be back," Sarah said, studying the report. "And they'll try to adapt to what we've shown them here. But that's the beauty of analog technology. There's no code to update, no software to modify. Sometimes the simplest solution is the hardest to counter." The battle for Mars was over, but it was only the beginning. The crystal entities would return, possibly with new tactics, definitely in greater numbers. But humanity had proven that their strategy could work, and now they had time to prepare Earth's defenses using the lessons learned from this first engagement. The analog revolution had begun, and with it, perhaps a fundamental shift in how the galaxy viewed technological progress. Symphony of static. The vast array of radio telescopes at Arecibo II stretched across the lunar crater, their dishes pointed toward the approaching crystal swarm. Dr. Maya Patel hadn't slept in nearly 48 hours, but she couldn't tear herself away from the readings scrolling across her oscilloscope screens. Something in the pattern had caught her attention, a rhythm in the static that seemed almost musical. "Admiral," she called out, her voice hoarse from too much coffee and too little rest. "I think you need to see this." Admiral Williams appeared at her shoulder almost immediately. After the successful defense of Mars, Earth had accelerated its conversion to analog technology, and the lunar base had become the heart of their observation network. The victory had bought them time, but the crystal entities had regrouped and were now approaching with a force 10 times larger than before. "Look at these patterns," Maya said, adjusting the frequency display. "When the entities communicate with each other, they don't just use quantum entanglement like we thought. There's a secondary signal, an electromagnetic resonance that acts as a carrier wave." She switched between different recordings, showing similar patterns repeating across various frequencies. "It's like they're singing to each other, using frequencies that modern sensors are too precise to detect. But our old radio equipment picks it up perfectly. Kenza studied the patterns intently. Can we disrupt it? Better. Maya's fingers flew across the controls, bringing up a new set of readings. We can hijack it. These old AM radio transmitters, the really powerful ones they used for international broadcasting back in the 20th century, they operate on frequencies that interact directly with the entity's communication pattern. She pointed to a particular sequence in the data. See this. When we caught that small cluster near Phobos, they weren't just retreating from our analog weapons. They were thrown into disarray because our radio emissions were interfering with their ability to coordinate. The implications hit Kenza like a thunderbolt. You're saying we can use old radio transmitters as weapons? Not just weapons, Maya replied, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in her excitement. We can create a disruption field that would affect their entire network. Every AM radio transmitter on Earth, every old spacecraft communication array, even the emergency broadcast systems. If we coordinate them properly, we could generate a symphony of static that would throw their entire force into chaos. Kenza was already moving to the communication station. Get me Colonel Chen on Mars. Then patch me through to every major command center on Earth. And someone wake up the myriad Alliance representatives. They're going to want to hear this. The next 12 hours were a blur of activity. Around the world, engineers and technicians raced to reactivate old radio transmission stations that hadn't been used in decades. Space crews worked to convert communication satellites into broadband radio transmitters. The Myriad Alliance, finally convinced of the effectiveness of human primitive technology, offered their own ships as platforms for additional transmitters. In orbit around Mars, Colonel Sarah Chen supervised the modification of the defense platforms that had proved so effective in the first battle. The crystal entities will be expecting our analog weapons now, she reported over the secure line to Luna Base. They've already shown signs of adapting their approach vectors to minimize exposure. That's why we need every transmitter ready, Kenza replied. Dr. Patel's analysis suggests that their adaptation to our weapons actually makes them more vulnerable to communication disruption. They're having to coordinate more closely, rely more heavily on their quantum network, which means they'll be even more susceptible to our interference. Sarah finished. Clever. What's the range on this disruption field? Theoretically, much larger than our weapons. The old AM transmitters were designed to bounce signals off the ionosphere, reach halfway around the world. In space, with no atmosphere to attenuate them. Maya let the implications hang. The crystal entities made their move just as the last transmitters were coming online. They appeared at the edge of the solar system in a vast swarm that made their previous forces look like scouting parties. Their crystalline structures caught the light of the sun, creating a glittering cloud that might have been beautiful if it wasn't so deadly. They've learned from Mars, Sarah reported, watching the swarms approach. They're spreading out more, trying to minimize the effect of our analog weapons. And they're singing. The radio interference from their communication is much stronger this time. Maya nodded, monitoring the patterns. They're coordinating more actively, probably trying to develop countermeasures to our technology. It's exactly what we want them to do. The entities crossed Jupiter's orbit, their formation shifting and flowing like a school of fish, probing for weaknesses. Earth's combined defense fleet, a mix of retrofitted human ships and powered-down alien vessels, waited in staged positions throughout the inner solar system. All stations, this is Admiral Williams. Kenza broadcast across the emergency channels. Operation Symphony is now in effect. All transmitters prepare to activate on my mark. The crystal swarm accelerated, probably detecting the powered-down ships and assuming they had caught Earth's defenses in a vulnerable state. They passed the orbit of Mars, where Colonel Chen's forces waited silently, their analog weapons powered down to avoid early detection. Time to show them what real electronic warfare looks like, Maya said, her hands poised over the control panel. From before electronics were smart enough to be hacked. Kenza waited until the swarm committed to their attack vector, until they were too far committed to easily retreat. Then she gave the order that would test their boldest strategy yet. All stations, begin transmission. Across Earth, around Mars, and throughout the solar system, hundreds of radio transmitters powered up simultaneously. Each one had been precisely tuned to frequencies that Maya had identified as critical to the crystal entity's communication network. The combined transmissions created a web of overlapping signals, a carefully orchestrated symphony of static that filled space with patterns designed to interfere with the entity's quantum-based consciousness. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The perfect coordination of the crystal swarm shattered as their communication network dissolved into chaos. Clusters of entities began moving randomly, colliding with each other as their ability to synchronize broke down. Some began to spin in place, their crystalline structures resonating with frequencies they had never evolved to handle. Multiple targets showing signs of complete network failure, Sarah reported from Mars. Their formation is breaking apart. Individual entities are trying to regroup, but they can't maintain coherence through the interference. The battle wasn't over. The entities were numerous enough that even in disarray, they posed a significant threat, but without their perfect coordination, without the ability to adapt and overcome as a unified force, they were vulnerable to the conventional attacks from Earth's retrofitted weapons. Maya watched the oscilloscope readings as the symphony of static continued to play across space, a weapon created from technology that most of the galaxy had dismissed as obsolete. In the end, it wasn't advanced quantum computers or sophisticated AI that turned the tide. It was the simple, brutal efficiency of crude radio waves, broadcast with enough power to drown out the subtle songs of their crystalline enemies. The next phase of the battle was about to begin, and Earth's forces were ready. Sometimes, Maya reflected, watching the patterns of chaos spread through the enemy swarm, the most effective weapons are the ones your enemy has forgotten how to fear. Victory in simplicity. Space itself seemed to vibrate with the power of Earth's coordinated radio broadcast. The crystal swarm, once a perfect formation of synchronized destruction, had devolved into chaos. But even in disarray, they were far from defeated. Admiral Kenza Williams watched from the Lunar Command Center as the final battle for Earth began to unfold. Multiple entity clusters are attempting to reform, reported Dr. Maya Patel, her eyes fixed on the oscilloscope displays. They're trying to adapt their communication frequencies to compensate for our interference. They won't succeed. Colonel Chen's voice crackled through the radio from her position near Mars. Every time they find a clear frequency, we shift our broadcast pattern. They're fighting against the fundamental nature of analog signals. There's no perfect solution, no code to crack, just an endless sea of static. The Myriad Alliance fleet, positioned in a defensive sphere around Earth, watched in amazement as humanity's primitive technology continued to hold one of the most dangerous threats in galactic history at bay. Their own ships, running on minimal power to avoid crystal infiltration, stood ready to support Earth's forces if needed. "Admiral," Maya called out suddenly, "I'm detecting a change in their resonance patterns. The larger clusters, they're attempting something new." On the main display, several of the larger crystal formations began to pulse with intense energy. Their structures shifted, becoming more dense, more focused. The radio interference that had been disrupting their communications seemed to have less effect on these concentrated forms. They're sacrificing their ability to coordinate with the wider swarm, Maya analyzed, adjusting her instruments, trading their network advantage for increased individual resilience. These clusters are acting independently, each one becoming a self-contained unit. Kenza nodded grimly. Adapt or die. They're learning that their greatest strength, their perfect coordination, has become a vulnerability. So they're trying to become something else entirely. The transformed crystal clusters began to advance, pushing through the disruption field with grim determination. They were fewer in number now, but each one represented a concentration of the swarm's power. Earth's radio transmissions could no longer throw them into complete chaos. All defense stations. Kenza broadcast. Phase 2 is now in effect. Engage with analog weapons as targets present themselves. Across the solar system, humanity's retrofitted defenses came to life. Rail guns powered by massive vacuum tubes opened fire. Electromagnetic pulse weapons, built using technology that predated the digital age, began to target the approaching clusters. The mechanical computers controlling these weapons might have been crude, but they were immune to crystal infiltration and perfectly capable of calculating firing solutions. The battle that followed was unlike anything in the history of space warfare. The crystal entities, forced to abandon their usual tactics of technological subversion, met humanity's analog weapons in direct combat. Each engagement was a brutal exercise in physics and fundamental forces, with neither side able to rely on advanced technology for an advantage. Entity cluster approaching Defense Line 7, called out a tactical officer. They're attempting to. Are they trying to physically absorb our defense platforms? Confirm that. Colonel Chen responded from Mars. They're adapting again, trying to convert our analog technology directly into crystalline structures. But the process is slow without their usual digital infiltration methods. Target those clusters with maximum power to disrupt their conversion attempts. The battle continued for hours, a grinding war of attrition that tested the limits of both humanity's retrofitted technology and the crystal entity's ability to adapt. The entities that had successfully condensed themselves fought with terrible efficiency, but they were outnumbered now. Without their network advantage, without the ability to coordinate perfectly across vast distances, they could be isolated and destroyed one by one. Admiral, Maya's voice cut through the tactical chatter. I'm detecting a new pattern in the entity remnants. The survivors, they're synchronizing again, but differently this time. It's not combat coordination. It almost looks like. Like what? Like they're trying to communicate with us. The remaining crystal clusters had indeed stopped their attack. They hung in space, pulsing with complex patterns that Maya's instruments struggled to decode. After several tense minutes, she looked up from her screens with an expression of wonder. They're surrendering, she said quietly. But more than that, they're offering an exchange. Knowledge for knowledge. The patterns continued, becoming clearer as Maya refined her analysis. The crystal entities, it seemed, had achieved something that none of their previous victims had managed. They had forced them to confront the limitations of their own evolution. They've encountered countless advanced civilizations, Maya explained, translating the patterns, each one more sophisticated than the last, each one falling to their ability to infiltrate and subvert complex technology. We're the first species they've met who proved that advancing technology isn't always the answer, that sometimes the solution lies in understanding the fundamental principles that underlie all technology. Kenza shared a look with the myriad Alliance representatives, who had been watching the battle with increasing appreciation for humanity's primitive approach. They want to learn from us. They want to understand how we think, Maya clarified. How we can embrace both complexity and simplicity, how we can step backward to move forward. And in return, they're offering to share everything they've learned from every civilization they've encountered. The implications were staggering. The crystal entities possessed knowledge spanning thousands of worlds, countless approaches to technology and science, but they had been trapped by their own evolution, unable to conceive of solutions that didn't involve ever-increasing complexity, until humanity showed them another way. Send word to all commands, Kenza ordered after a long moment of consideration. Combat operations are suspended pending further orders, and get me a secure line to Earth's government. They're going to want to hear this directly. As the tension of battle faded, replaced by the cautious hope of an unexpected peace, Kenza found herself reflecting on the strange path that had led them here. Humanity, the youngest and least advanced spacefaring civilization in the galaxy, had succeeded where far more sophisticated species had failed, not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through their ability to understand and embrace the simple solutions that others had forgotten. You know what this means, Maya said softly, still monitoring the crystal entity's communications. Once word of this spreads, every advanced civilization in the galaxy is going to want